Welcome to Toward a Quality of Life. Thank you for being with us. This is a live show. This is your opportunity to call in at 742-3333 and ask us any questions you may have about psychology or anything that would be pertinent to things that we will be speaking of this evening. Psychology is a very large science with a long history to it, as long as practically we have people being on Earth. And today it is sort of in the background of major kinds of intellectual endeavors as we live in a more technological age, and fields such as computer processing and technology are far more in the forefront. However, I hope that by talking to you, I can instill in you a kind of curiosity or furtherance of looking towards concepts that are psychological, however they are evolved and however they are arrived at, namely concepts that look at people, how they are, who they are, what they stand for, how they come to be and do what they do, and how, most of all, we as people can work on ourselves to change the way we are, to change the life we live, so that we will have fewer problems in living than we do. After all, this is always the point of a science, to make better. The only reason we even have a science is to make better the situation and history and circumstances that we find ourselves in being alive. Now, besides psychology being rather in the background somewhat today, as for example, relative to periods such as the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s, it is also divided into many other new categories of intellectual pursuits. Those such as neuroscience, psycholinguistics, biological psychology, information processing, artificial intelligence, etc., etc., etc. But in time, it is very likely that psychology will in fact take its place in more of a forefront of human endeavor, human science, human thought, and human striving. And my position is that in order for psychology to fully actualize, fully materialize, and fully become everything that it was ever meant to be for us and our future, we would be well served to radically change our way of thinking. Radically change our way of thinking from conditioned ideas and habit patterns we have about what we should do, who we are, and whether our life should be examined whatsoever to begin with. Psychology is a hard science and a knowable science. It's not soft, as some people would have us believe, because its terms are descriptive and not quantitative. That is to say, properly used, most of what comes out as genuine psychology will have a lot of verbal explanation and even perhaps video explanation. The raw material of what we are as living, acting human beings is the datum of psychology. As such, it's not something mathematical or in amounts that can be measured in a quantitative way, and so it's sometimes spoken of as a soft science. However, it is decidedly hard, decidedly rigorous, and highly knowledgeable and advanced at this stage in our culture and world. The datum of psychology is behavior description of the intricate organization of what a person does, says, or feels. The datum of psychology is behavior description. That is to say, using very intricate, precise exactly syntactically structured language to describe the intricate organization of what a person does, says, feels, etc. In other words, psychology applies to everything. Psychology applies to my behavior, my behaving and living and being right now, my motivations behind it, my posturing and expression as I speak to you, my thoughts in advance of what I'm currently talking as I try to think of what I'm going to say, my perceptions of environmental factors that are impinging on me that I am conscious of, including those that I am less than conscious of or just not paying attention to at the present time. How many things is the brain and body capable of? Imagine that I could be aware of all these things at any one time, including that I'm speaking to you out there in metropolitan Boston, including that there's a city scene happening in a window to my left, people all around me, technical factors to consider, thoughts to keep in mind that I want to convey to you, and besides that, in the mix of all that, trying to get onto a natural flow and just talk to you as though I weren't thinking about any of these things at all. In other words, the art of being casual and relaxed and most germane because of being able to be casual and relaxed. In psychology, what we can do from here on in with all the knowledges we have so far is go towards a more psychologically environmental. Now I use the word environment. Some of you may have seen previous shows I've had where I inevitably bring up problems of the natural physical environment, our weather, our water, our food, which is in such dire circumstance. That's a broad, most common use of the word environment. But when I say environment now in psychology, I am talking about any kind of stimulus factor, any kind of contingency, be it internal to you, such as a crick in your neck, or a sense of fear, or a problem that's going around in the back of your mind even though you're not literally focusing on it right now, or the fact that you may be feeling warm or cold from the temperature of a room. These are the kind of factors, including the mega factors, the ones that get more and more molar. They're the microscopic ones, and then the ones that are bigger and get more molar that you are carrying with you by cumulative virtue of your history. You are a snowball of experience and input, not just things happening to you, but you're an actor as well. Not only are you an actor de facto, as a matter of fact, you're also an actor existentially, for the fact that you are the feeling, thinking, knowing being that has to do something for oneself and about oneself and has to live inside one's skin every waking moment of every hour, and even during sleep, when you might, for example, be having dreams or be in delta states of deep, deep sleep, or in shallow states of less relaxed sleep, and even, unfortunately, nightmares. So you see, your psychology is never away from you. You cannot escape it. As the saying goes, you can run, but you cannot hide. So we may go, for our benefit, towards a more psychologically environmental and phenomenological frame of mind, which will synthesize all the major lines of reasoning in psychology. Phenomenological, just the living way of being and feeling just as I am right now, thinking, trying not to be conscious of myself, or if I am, that too being a phenomenon of being alive. Broadly speaking, and there are so many, these things are so massive to try to communicate. So I'm wiping and painting with a very, very broad brush, but very broadly speaking. There are three major broad umbrellas underneath the grand concept of psychology. One of these that is known to everybody in some sense is currently today called dynamic psychology, coming from a history of what we know as psychoanalytic psychology, coming from what we know to be psychoanalysis, and of course the great creator Sigmund Freud of that branch and field of psychology, which, like it or hate it, has made a huge impact on who we are and how we think about human life, whether we are thinking of it professionally or as people who are not in the profession whatsoever. Psychoanalytic psychology is called dynamic today over years of change for the reason that it deals with so-called inner dynamics, one of the underlying principles of psychoanalysis, that there are levels and areas and inner kinds of not static but active pressures, forces, resistances, allowances, levels of consciousness, and so on, that are in constant interplay with each other with some degree of force as a living, breathing thing within oneself and in interaction with one's life environment. Next, we have I should go back and say that psychoanalysis came to us mainly around the turn of the century out of Europe and has had a very long history and impact. At the same time, a different school of psychology, totally unlike a dynamic idea of the human being, was beginning in Europe as well, under a branch broadly called experimental psychology and brought down to us today as behavioral psychology, which is much more of a mechanical, exteriorly oriented kind of psychology, not positing very deeply about the inner psyche, so to speak, of a human being. The inner soul, the inner workings, the inner needs, the inner complexes, but more looking at, basically, broadly, how a human being is shaped by circumstances, conditioned, if you will, learning, if you will, and molded to be what is apparent to us in behavior. And finally, the third very big movement and division of psychology, if you will, is one that comes out of philosophy, one that comes out of the work of many great philosophers, probably primarily Jean-Paul Sartre. Of course, Nietzsche, known as an existentialist as well. Existential psychology. The living and feeling of one's own life just as it is to oneself, the idea of having will, the idea of being able to be in control of one's own life to the extent that one must take responsibility for one's own life, and oneself is the person on whom all life challenge and all life strivings into the future falls, and one's self is pretty much the beginning and end of what one's life can be. Even the word self is a word in psychology. I should go back and say too that behavioral psychology is most closely identified, of course, with the late, very noted psychologist, Dr. B.F. Skinner, who was at Harvard. He started at University of Minnesota and was at Harvard for many years. And he passed away not too long ago. He would not refer to himself as a behavioral psychologist, but he is connected and a huge layer down of what is known as behaviorism. And one of the famous parts about Dr. Skinner is he would so often say, there is no soul or spirit or needs or complexes or underlying dynamics that you have to look for, or even physiology. For example, blood pressure changes that you have to look for to identify human behavior. He was a complete propounder of, you show me the environment and the organism or the person, and I will show you the behavior. So he was a very strict environmentalist till his dying day. He also, by the way, was a person who had great faith in human beings, as do many great thinkers, and devoted his life to trying to change how societies are structured. And he was not a religious man, and when he was passing and knew he would be passing, he maintained that he was not a religious person. Now, when we speak of behavior psychology too, and experimental psychology, we have so many kinds of other things to bring forward, like motivation and the gradients, what makes motives, small motives, big motives, what keeps motives motivated, what makes motives dissipate. Parameters of learning, observing and learning, having trials and learning, modeling your behavior and learning, motor behavior and control, how we do what we do motorically is a big part of our psychology, not only because it expresses something, but because it is us. Our motor behavior is us as people moving on the environment. Motor, muscle. Sensory behavior, which is our electrical wires, our nerves taking in information. Reflexes, conditioning, semantics, language, perception, how we perceive, what we see, what you see when you're watching me. How many different perceptions people have as they are watching. Some may be vaguely unwatching even. Others may watch intently. And what different perceptions they may have. What things they may be attending to, both physically and psychologically. Then we have our physiology. Our heart beats faster when we're scared. Our stomach twists when we're nervous. So many factors, both positive and more tense, about our physiology. Then we have personalities and the dimensions of our personalities. Are we narcissistic? Do we think only of ourselves? Are we gregarious? Are we generous? Are we pensive? Are we introverted? Are we extroverted? Are we dynamic? Are we static? The study of animals is a part of psychology. Both animal psychology and study of animals in their natural habitats, known as ethology. The study of people in groups, not just us alone. The study of people, and do you know you behave differently when you're with another person than when you're alone? And think about the things you may do when you're alone that you would not do with another person, just by virtue of there being another person, and how many things you would do with another person that you wouldn't do when you're alone. How differently you may behave when you go to a rock concert or a football game and you're among many, many persons. Your behavior will be changed. How your behavior would be changed if you suddenly were in the midst of a parade. Social psychology. And so much goes on. So just to summarize this brief, broad view of psychology, we have three main types, generally, very generally speaking. Dynamic, psychoanalytically derived psychology, beginning basically with Dr. Sigmund Freud out of Vienna, today called dynamic psychology. Behavioral psychology, historically attributed to a person named Dr. Watson, who trained little Albert in that unfortunate experiment where he made a baby have tense emotions and fear to a rat by conditioning him to feel that way. But most closely, and also with Dr. Pavlov out of Russia, who did invasive research on animals, which you know, if you've watched my show at all, I am completely against. But he did do invasive research on animals, and he explained what today is known as classical conditioning by the idea that certain of our responses will automatically come into play without us even knowing it or trying to have them do so, by being conditioned to things that are part of our basic drive makeup. In this case, a dog salivating automatically to food and being conditioned to a bell that precedes food because of the automatic salivation to food being paired with the bell, and therefore the bell, after so many times, itself causing the dog to salivate. But most of all, behaviorism is truly brought to us today and identified with Dr. B.F. Skinner. And finally, existential psychology, beginning with the noted philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, although others, of course, always come before. Also, Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, and handed down to other famous psychologists such as Rollo May, perhaps R.D. Laing, and others continuing today. Now, as I was mentioning in the beginning, psychology is pretty much identical to being alive. It's us. It's what we're about. It's not how you build a building. It's not what is atomic structure or what is computer coding information. Psychology is about human beings. And perhaps some people are made a bit uncomfortable by it because it often means that it's kind of looking at ourselves in the mirror and trying to get a close look at who we are, going as deep as possible to know ourselves, to figure out things, and as I said before, with science, to try to make ourselves and the life that we live better. We wouldn't even bother. If this were paradise, if this were nirvana, if this were heaven, there would not be science. Because science comes about because questions are asked. Questions are asked of things that are not known, and questions are asked of things that present themselves as problems. So that's why we have ologies, psychologies, and biologies, to learn about things that we don't know about and things that present themselves to us as challenges. In thinking about psychology, we're looking at ourselves. The beginnings of psychology regarding recorded thought go back to early philosophers who were asking questions such as, who am I? What is the nature of life? Is there a God? What categories of behavior or spirit or psyche can we define personalities and person types into? How are groups of people best served organizationally? In other words, what kind of systems best reflect human needs, human nature? What are human needs? What is intellect? What is wisdom? What is the idea or way to learning something because we sense that we don't know a lot about ourselves? We sense, even from early on, that there's just a lot of uncertainty and a lot of unknowns. And you know, today we look at cultures of the past or cultures in countries other than our own, and we look at their ways of articulating and divining and figuring out and having explanations for what is this world around them that they are by no means secure in and feel a need to know more about, to gain some wisdom about. We just had a question come in, and I thank you for the question. The question is, why do people act out of control after drinking alcohol? And of course, people do many things when they drink alcohol. This is a very interesting phenomenon. Not all people have the same kind of response from drinking alcohol. Some people get quiet, and other people get very unquiet. Okay, we have another question here. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So you see the interplay of personality, that alcohol affects people differently. The original part of drinking has an effect of sort of loosening people up and making them think they feel more relaxed and less inhibited. And then as they drink more alcohol and it affects the brain, depending on their personality and their probably physiological makeup, they are affected differently. What alcohol does when people act out of control is it disinhibits parts of our neural function that are involved in keeping behaviors in check. It breaks down the gates to what we normally have in our everyday responding of of having our comportment follow the rules and disciplines and conventions of usual everyday behavior. Now, I'm sure that physiochemically there are different centers of the brain on which alcohol can act to perhaps cause disinhibition to lead to acts of violence and rage. Also, this would have to come in combination with the personality you're dealing with to begin with, and this goes back to this idea of dynamics that I was speaking of before, that people have inner kinds of complexes and personalities, if you will, that are kept in check, either consciously or unconsciously. And the effects of alcohol in loosening people up can bring these parts of behavior to the fore and make it easier for people to act with abandon, so to speak. Also, alcohol can make people feel very depressed in a great number of cases, bringing on moods that are hard, that bring sadness. So there are many different kinds of responses to alcohol, but what it is basically is a disinhibiting drug to the brain. We had a second question that came in which asks, what is the effect of El Nino on the psyche, on the human psyche? I think there are many ways and levels in which the human psyche would be affected by El Nino, so to speak, just like with anything. And the first one that comes to mind is that people are so concerned about El Nino. That's the first thing it's going to have, is people are, oh no, El Nino, this is getting scary. People are talking about something that seems too real, and we've already experienced so many bad weather patterns, we surely don't want to see more. So right up front, people are concerned, and it's receiving a lot of press. So it would have that effect on the psyche, a very conscious effect. Now, weather patterns of ocean temperatures and ocean currents and atmospheric changes can affect one's psyche is not a silly question. It's entirely probable that such patterns, outside of us just knowing that they're coming and being worried, can be influencing us, just as patterns of the lunar cycle and any other earth cycles and any other earth waves and earth forces, some of which we may very well not have senses to be attuned to, because one thing we are not is as smart as we think we are. That's one of the hoaxes, I think, on us, that we're not the all-knowing creatures. If we were, we wouldn't even bother with all these questions and topics, as I said before, that we're thinking about. So, would barometric changes? Certainly. You know, I'm certain if we decided to get very focused and specific and try to study what barometric changes can do to persons, I'm sure we could find where they have their effects. It's something I'm not particularly looking into. Okay, just would you hold that question? We have another question, and I'll get to it in 1 second. So, I'm not familiar with what anyone might have said or found out about what El Nino can do to the human psyche, but it's not at all silly to think that it can be having an effect in many ways. We have a severely depressed person. That's too bad. Why do I need to drink when I go out? I need to use it to meet people. This, very lightly and loosely speaking, very generally speaking, has a lot to do with one's conditioning, and conditioning is how you've come to be who you are for any number of reasons, including your own temperament and makeup. And your conditioning and personality type may be a type that is insecure, or it may be a type that is unsure or fearful of people or scared of being ridiculed, or introverted and not gregarious and outgoing. Even though you'd like to have companionship, you may be more of an introverted person. There's any number of ways you could be, many of them from your conditioning. And so everybody wants to have companionship and talk to people in some way, shape, or form. So taking alcohol, as I said, is a disinhibitor. Any inhibitions you have, and I don't mean inhibitions of just standing around being inhibited, no, but normal inhibitions you have of following rules and convention and comporting yourself in ways that you're socialized into behaving as, those kinds of inhibitions will break down under the influence of alcohol. So you take the alcohol. Now, one thing a person might do very gradually and very gently is try to, within one's own available capacity, try to force oneself to go forward and talk to someone or meet someone without taking alcohol, or at least try to do it on a very limited basis. If you can even hold off taking alcohol for 3 minutes or 5 minutes, you can work on a program, self-monitoring yourself and shaping your own behavior. Playing games with yourself, seeing how far you can go, not taking alcohol and yet meeting people. And if you can't succeed, if you can't even make that first move, you might just have it as an agenda that you would try, that if you had the capacity to do that, you would do that. And one thing you must not do is, if you cannot succeed in reaching a little goal that you set for yourself, sort of a sub-goal, a mini-goal, do not berate yourself. Do not feel bad. What you only must do is always try the best. And if you're trying your best and you really can't, do not berate yourself. But these are patterns we get into. And it's often best to not get into habits of taking alcohol or taking drugs, especially when you're going into something that's causing you tension, to try to avoid taking that drink so you will relax. It's one thing to take a drink because you have some time, you're free, you want to relax. It's another to take it because you need to relax, and that's the way you're using it. So if you can at all avoid starting with that kind of a pattern, using a drug or alcohol in order to get through difficult situations, try to avoid it, because that's a bad pattern. You should try to go through tension-producing and difficult situations that you start to get into with your own self to the degree that you can handle it. And like I say, if you can't, don't set high goals. Everybody's behavior and places of being in this life are different. We're all here, we're all working on things, we're all in different places. We all have what might look like something easy to one person is infinitely hard to another. Don't compare yourself on those kinds of scales. Just decide what little things you can try to work on and play games with yourself to get better in teeny-weeny ways, by a minute. By short amounts of time, or 1 glass less, 1 ounce less. Play games with yourself. And if you can't do it, don't berate yourself. You are where you are, as long as you're doing the best you can and trying to be honest with yourself if you can help it. Now, another person is asking, when I go out, how can I avoid drinking? Well, if you're going into a bar when you go out, that's going to be pretty hard to do. Unless you're talking about if you're going to parties where you have a choice of alcohol. Of course, in bars you can have. Now, if we're talking behaviorally, one of the broad fields I mentioned before, certainly the environment has everything to do with what you're going to do. So if you go into a bar and there's alcohol all around, and drinking alcohol is the norm, and people basically are there to drink alcohol. People are really there mostly to talk to each other, meet each other, possibly to get together physically with each other for just one, brief interludes, which basically nobody wins over the long run, especially not females on that score. But you're in an environment that's just telling you drink, drink, drink. It's pervasive. So you'd be up against extremely great odds if you feel like taking alcohol and you don't want to, but you're going into bars to talk with people that you're already with or to meet people. So the first thing would be, to not be in such an environment. But some people are strong. I know people who have been able to stop alcohol and take sodas and still but they did have very hard times they'd rather not be around alcohol drinking situations. But they can't. I've seen cases of people being able to build themselves to being in those circumstances and taking soda. But it's a real almost foregone conclusion. If the alcohol is everywhere and you don't want to drink it, you're in a situation, the probability of which is almost 100% driving you to drink. Another thing is, too, with alcoholism and depression, our life is moving so fast and we are segregated from each other. We're not in constant communication with each other, and that's making a lot of people feel isolated. And I think a lot of depression and drinking is coming from feeling alone and not having any consistent, tangible, reappearing and constant and normative connections of just living amongst each other and being in close, genuine contact. So please, again, don't berate yourself. We're living in times that are conducive to for many, many reasons. That's not an excuse, but there are so many things pressing on us to be inebriated and to escape through alcohol and drugs. And both legally and illegally, there is so much force by media and by companies and so on promoting us to go for those kinds of escapes. And the other thing is, too, alcohol is somewhat associated with the idea of life is a breeze, just have some alcohol. Only now with all the pressures and tensions and senses of aloneness that people have and kind of despair, people go overboard, though people have gone overboard for years. And life is not a breeze. Life is not a bowl of cherries. That's the big lie. I'm not saying life is bad, but life is hard. Life is suffering in a way. So if we're being told that we're just supposed to be in some great field of fun, it's really not true. And the images that portray this themselves are not in great fields of fun, but they're portraying that because it's very attractive. It's kind of like from biblical times when it was noted that many temptations were put before people and they fell for them every which way. Anything that's easy and escapist and presumably free and without responsibility is very tempting and very alluring. And we seem to fall for that. Yes, so I think it's some consolation if we could come to understand, but not to. We've got to make the best. We have to go forward, of course. But life is not some kind of easy, breezy phenomenon. So going back to history and psychology, being as old as people being alive as far as we know itself, we come from the philosophers over the ages into finally in the previous century a branching off into fields that started to be known as psychology, separated from the parent philosophy. And psychology as a science was very new from the beginning of this century and moving along decade by decade, coming alive really very, very heartily after World War I and growing since then. There were so many questions about human behavior. Militarily speaking, there was testing questions of how can we know who to recruit and what kind of jobs to give them and what kind of capacities and abilities we need. And then people started looking at children and how they mature and so on. So this started it really coming on more strongly. And then, at least in this country, although it was going as an endeavor in Europe as well, all this time. And then in the 60s, the 50s, the 60s, psychology was not something people thought of in the forefront of things, but it started to really burgeon. And many people started to study it and go towards psychology. And so many kinds of thinkings and theories and hypotheses and descriptions and case studies were being done on how people live and what is it about human behavior. People getting more and more interested and centered and focused on looking at what people are, what are they about, what makes them do what they do, what are the things they're living for, what are the needs they have inside, what are the ways they're shaped and conditioned, and what can be done about problems we have as human beings in living. And that doesn't mean only so-called mental health problems. That's something I always have to make a note of. That when we speak of psychology, we hardly mean pathology. We hardly mean so-called mental illness. We mean everything about people. Their hopes, their aspirations, their personalities, their learning, their temperaments, their motivations, and so on. All of this is psychology. Well, we are coming to the conclusion of this time that we have this evening. I hope to be coming on with more shows during which you'd be able to ask questions. I just have a few parting thoughts very quickly. Separate from specifics of psychology. One is that I saw recently at someone's home a movie they rented, directed by Clint Eastwood, who gave us all that void maleness and void participation of the human culture in the movies that he's done. He did a movie recently about a cat burglar, and in the movie there's a scene in which a woman or a man try to kill each other. It was so bad to look at, I couldn't really get the details. Anyway, the woman is viciously killed, and the camera stays on it for a long time. and the woman is stabbed and bleeding and screaming and raped, I believe. I had to leave the room. This is a brand new movie. It could be up for an Emmy, who knows. Graphic, detailed, long. There's the woman, bleeding, screaming, sexually violated. There's another ad on television right now by a major brokerage house which shows a woman at a laptop computer, scantily clad. The camera goes over, Victoria's Secret type under things. Man's laying half naked in bed. The woman's sitting in a lotus position in front of her computer. She scores a trade and screams in the sexual scream. People, I just ask you, when are we going to stop furthering what's happening to women and the way that we keep on letting them scream and bleed and be hurt? There was one thing in the Clint Eastwood movie that made me think of it besides that and bring it to you, and that is one good thing I heard in that movie. And that movie said, tomorrow is not guaranteed. So I leave you with that message that tomorrow is not guaranteed. Whatever you should find out about yourself or struggle with or try in your own special way that is particular to you and where you find yourself in life, do it to the best of your ability right now, because tomorrow is not guaranteed. Thank you for being with me this evening, and I hope to see you again soon. Good night.